The piercing roar tore through the silence of the crimson wasteland, shattering the deceptive tranquility of the alien landscape. Ethel ran with every ounce of strength his body could muster, clutching a heavy spear in his calloused hand. The red dust of this foreign world swirled around his worn boots as he charged toward the desperate sounds that echoed across the barren plains. His lungs burned with each labored breath, muscles screaming in protest after days of ceaseless travel. But he could not allow himself to slow down. Not when lives hung in the balance. Not when his instincts told him that history was about to repeat itself in the cruelest way possible. Memories flashed through his mind as he ran, faces of those he had failed to protect before, their expressions frozen in terror as disaster struck. The weight of those losses drove his legs forward despite the exhaustion that threatened to bring him to his knees. He would not fail again. He could not. Ahead, near a formation of bizarre rock formations that jutted from the ground like the spines of some enormous buried creature, a tragedy was unfolding before his eyes. A massive, bear-like predator, with bony protrusions along its spine, a bone ripper, as Ethel had come to call these apex predators, was mauling an adult blue-skinned alien female. Despite her obvious strength and agility, the female fought desperately against the creature that outweighed her by several hundred pounds, her movements becoming increasingly frantic as the beast's savage fury overwhelmed her defenses. "Hey, over here!" Ethel shouted with all the force his parched throat could muster, hoping to divert the creature's attention from its victim. His voice echoed across the crimson wasteland, bouncing off the strange rock formations that surrounded them. The sound seemed pitifully inadequate against the overwhelming presence of the monster that continued its relentless assault. The Bone Ripper's massive head swiveled toward the new threat, bloodshot eyes fixing on the human with predatory focus. But the moment of distraction came too late for the blue-skinned woman. With horrific efficiency, the predator delivered a fatal blow, its jagged claws tearing through the woman's torso. Her azure blood, startlingly vivid against the red earth, spilled across the dusty ground, creating a stark and terrible contrast that would haunt Ethel's dreams for months to come. Now the beast turned fully toward him, momentarily sated but still driven by the bloodlust that made these creatures so feared across the uncharted regions of this planet. Saliva dripped from its jagged teeth, mixing with the blue blood that matted the coarse fur around its muzzle. Ethel had encountered these monsters before during his months of solitary survival on this hostile world. He had studied their movements from safe distances, noted their weaknesses, and even scavenged their kills when desperate for sustenance. But academic knowledge was one thing. Facing such a monster in mortal combat was another entirely. The Bone Ripper charged with surprising speed, covering the distance between them in heart-stopping seconds. Ethel sidestepped, using the creature's considerable momentum against it, a technique he had seen the indigenous predators employ when hunting in packs. He jabbed with his spear, but missed the vital spots where the creature's thick hide gave way to more vulnerable flesh. The beast was unnervingly fast, quicker than anything its massive size had any right to be. It wheeled around with terrifying agility, massive paws slashing with claws that could disembowel a man with a single swipe. Ethel ducked beneath the attack, rolled through the red dust, and came up with his spear at the ready. His breathing was controlled now, his mind clear despite the mortal danger. This was survival in its purest form, the ancient dance of life and death that transcended planets and species. The dance played out across the red landscape as man and beast circled one another, each looking for the opening that would end the confrontation decisively. The creature lunged again, powerful haunches propelling it forward in a blur of muscle and bone. This time Ethel was ready. Years of training and months of desperate survival had honed his reflexes to a razor's edge. He drove his spear deep into the soft spot beneath the monster's throat, angling the weapon upward with all his strength to pierce the heart that pumped toxic levels of adrenaline through the creature's massive frame. The Bone Ripper let out a final terrible roar that seemed to shake the very air around them before collapsing to the ground, its enormous body going limp as death claimed it. Ethel stood over the fallen beast, chest heaving as he struggled to catch his breath. Blood covered him, his own from numerous small wounds sustained during the fight, and the creature's viscous, yellowish fluid that burned slightly where it touched exposed skin. The rush of combat began to fade, leaving behind the grim reality of what had just transpired. He had survived, but he had not been fast enough to save the blue-skinned woman who lay motionless several yards away. In that moment of somber reflection, a small figure emerged from behind a jagged rock where she had been hiding throughout the brutal encounter. A little alien girl with the same striking blue skin as the fallen woman approached cautiously. Her large, dark eyes, expressive despite their alien appearance, took in the horrific scene. Ethel with his bloody spear standing over the bodies of her mother and the beast that had killed her. Those eyes filled with tears and undisguised fury as she processed the tableau before her. "You hurt my mom! You!" she screamed in a high, clear voice that somehow translated into meaning Ethel could understand, though he had never heard the species' language before. The accusation hit him like a physical blow, the anguish in her voice transcending the barriers of biology and culture. Ethel froze, the child's words piercing him more deeply than any predator's claws could have. Slowly, deliberately, he lowered himself to one knee, placing himself closer to her height, though still towering over her small frame. With careful movements, he dropped his spear to the ground where it landed with a dull thud, sending a small cloud of red dust into the air. He showed her his empty, battle-wounded hands, a universal gesture of peace that he hoped would translate across the gulf of their different species. The child, Caitlin, as he would later learn her name to be, sobbed uncontrollably as she knelt beside her mother's body. Her small blue hands hovered over the mortal wounds, trembling with shock and grief. Ethel remained where he was, not daring to approach further. He waited patiently, respectfully, as the first overwhelming wave of grief washed over the small, blue-skinned child. His own eyes burned with unshed tears as he witnessed her suffering, a suffering he knew intimately from his own losses on this unforgiving world. When her sobs quieted somewhat, reduced to hitching breaths and soft whimpers, Ethel carefully extended his hand to point at the bone ripper's massive corpse. Then with slow, deliberate movements, he directed her attention to the terrible jagged wounds on her mother's body, distinctive injuries that could only have been caused by the creature's savage claws. He then pointed to the single clean puncture wound on the predator, the fatal injury from his spear that had ended the beast's rampage. His silent gestures spoke more eloquently than any shared language could have at that moment. He had not killed her mother. He had arrived too late to save her, but he had avenged her death. Caitlin looked at the wounds on her mother's body, then at the monstrous creature, and finally back at Ethel with his bloodied hands in earnest expression. Slowly, understanding dawned in her large, expressive eyes, replacing some of the accusation with confusion and lingering grief. A strong wind began to rise around them, lifting clouds of red dust into the air and creating swirling patterns against the strange purplish sky. A storm was approaching, one of the frequent dust tempests that could strip flesh from bone if one was caught unprepared in the open. Ethel knew from bitter experience that the scent of blood and the presence of fresh bodies would attract other predators, possibly even more bone rippers. With grim determination, he began gathering sizable stones from the surrounding area to cover the child's mother, providing her a measure of dignity in death that circumstances had denied her in her final moments. Caitlin, seeing this ritual begin to take shape, hesitated only briefly before joining him. She brought small pebbles that were manageable in her tiny hands, adding them reverently to the growing cairn. Together they created an improvised tomb, their shared labor forming the first tenuous bond between them, a bridge across the chasm of their differences. As the wind intensified and the first stinging particles of dust began to pelt them with increasing force, Ethel gestured toward a nearby cave entrance he had noticed during his approach. This time, Caitlin followed him without hesitation, recognizing the imminent danger of the approaching storm. The distant wail of other predators already responding to the scent of blood hastened their retreat. Inside the relative sanctuary of the cave, the storm raged with mounting fury, howling like some wounded beast denied its prey. The sound reverberated through the rocky chambers, creating an eerie counterpoint to the heavy silence between the human and the alien child. Ethel built a fire using techniques he had perfected during his months of survival, its orange light casting long, dancing shadows on the cave walls that seemed almost alive in their fluid movements. With methodical precision born of necessity, he began processing the bone ripper's massive carcass, which he had dragged into the cave before the storm hit. In this cruel world where resources meant the difference between life and death, nothing could be wasted, not even the body of a monster that had taken a life. The creature's hide would provide protection against the elements. Its bones could be fashioned into tools and weapons, and its meat, though bitter and tough, would sustain them through the coming days. He roasted a piece of the least gamey meat he could find and silently offered it to Caitlin, who sat huddled against the far wall of the cave, watching his every move with wary attention. After a moment's hesitation, hunger overcoming caution, she accepted the offering. Their first shared meal, food gained at the cost of her mother's life, passed in somber silence. The only sounds the crackling of the fire and the howling wind outside their shelter. The quiet between them was heavy with unspoken grief, questions without answers, and the uncertainty of what would follow this unexpected convergence of their fates. Ethel did not attempt to break the silence with words she would not understand or reassurances he had no right to give. Instead, he simply maintained the fire, kept watch for any predators that might brave the storm, and gave the child the space to process her devastating loss. Morning arrived with unexpected suddenness, the storm dissipating as quickly as it had formed and leaving behind a transformed landscape of newly sculpted dunes and exposed rock formations. Caitlin stirred from her fitful sleep against the cave wall, her large eyes immediately fixing on Ethel, with a mixture of wariness and desperate need. Without access to a shared language, they existed in a limbo of basic gestures and uncertain intentions. Taking a charged stick from the remnants of their fire, Caitlin approached the smooth section of the cave wall. With surprising dexterity, she began to draw a scene that told the story of the previous day through her eyes. A large figure, her mother, standing protectively beside a small one, herself. Then she added the enormous, frightening form of the bone ripper attacking them, its claws extended toward the larger figure. Finally, with careful attention to detail, she drew another figure, a man with a spear running toward the scene. When she finished, she turned to face Ethel, and in her gaze was no longer the accusation of the previous day, only profound pain and an unspoken question that transcended their language barrier. Why didn't you make it in time? The question struck Ethel to his core, reopening wounds of his own failures that had never truly healed. How could he explain the vastness of this world to a child? The distance he had covered at a dead run when he first heard the screams? The terror that had filled him when he realized he might be too late? Again? The crushing weight of responsibility for another life that he had not asked for but could not deny? He couldn't explain these complex emotions, not without shared language, and certainly not to a child who had just witnessed her mother's violent death. Instead, he took the charged stick from her small hand and drew his own addition to the scene. A sun low on the horizon, symbolizing time, the one resource that had run out before he could intervene effectively. Sometimes, despite our best efforts and most desperate wishes, there simply wasn't enough time to change the course of tragedy. Caitlin studied his addition to the drawing, her expression thoughtful beyond her years. Then, with deliberate movements, she added something new. A smaller figure holding the hand of the spear-bearer, walking away from the scene of death toward an unknown destination. It was a statement of intent, perhaps even forgiveness, that needed no translation. They set out together after sharing a sparse breakfast of leftover meat and water collected from a natural depression in the rocks outside the cave. Ethel led the way, his experienced eyes scanning the horizon for threats and opportunities alike. But now Caitlin walked beside him rather than trailing fearfully behind. She remained silent, the trauma of recent events still evident in her subdued demeanor. But there was a growing trust between them that manifested in small ways. A willingness to follow his lead, acceptance of the food and water he provided, and occasional glances that held more curiosity than fear. As they traveled through the alien landscape, their communication began to evolve beyond simple gestures. Caitlin pointed out edible plants that Ethel had avoided due to their strange appearance, demonstrating how to extract the nutritious pulp from forbidding exteriors. In return, he showed her how to find water in seemingly barren areas, locating the subtle signs that indicated moisture beneath the surface. They developed a crude sign language, supplemented by drawings in the dust when necessary that allowed them to share basic needs and warnings. They began to function not as reluctant companions thrown together by circumstance, but as a unit, two survivors against a hostile world, each with knowledge and abilities the other lacked. The blue-skinned child possessed an innate understanding of the local flora and fauna that Ethel, despite his scientific background, could never have developed independently. He offered protection, tool-making skills, and survival techniques that had kept him alive when all his companions had perished. During their journey across the stark but eerily beautiful landscape, Ethel began teaching Caitlin how to construct simple traps for the smaller creatures that scurried among the rocks and burrowed beneath the red soil. He demonstrated the patience required for hunting, the stillness that allowed one to blend into the environment until prey came within striking distance. She absorbed these lessons with remarkable speed, her natural intelligence evident despite their communication barriers. During one such lesson, as they lay in wait near a small watering hole frequented by rodent-like creatures with too many legs, Caitlin suddenly froze beside him. Before Ethel could question her reaction, she grabbed his arm with surprising strength and pulled him flat against the ground. A heartbeat later, a swarm of iridescent winged insects passed directly overhead, a species Ethel had encountered before and knew to be lethally venomous. The insects had approached from his blind side, moving silently on the air currents he had failed to monitor while focused on potential prey. Her connection with the natural rhythms of this world, her heightened awareness of threats that his human senses missed, had saved them both from painful deaths. As the deadly swarm passed beyond them, Ethel looked at his small companion with newfound respect. This child was not merely a burden to be protected. She was an ally whose unique abilities complemented his own. One night, as they camped in the shelter of a massive, hollowed-out tree-like organism whose thick branches provided cover from both predators and the elements, Ethel took a small, polished stone from the pocket of his tattered uniform. The smooth object caught the light of their small fire, reflecting it in a way that suggested it might not be entirely natural in origin. He clutched it tightly in his hand, the familiar contours pressing into his palm as they had countless times before. A look of deep, profound pain crossed his weathered face as memories assailed him. Memories of his own family, of the wife and child he had left behind on Earth to embark on this exploratory mission, of the colleagues whose bodies he had buried after their shuttle crashed on this uncharted world, of the final expedition member whose hand had slipped from his grasp during a flash flood in a canyon, much like the one they had crossed earlier that day. His failure to save Caitlin's mother had reopened these wounds, reminding him of all those he had been unable to protect despite his best efforts. Caitlin observed his suffering with the uncanny perception that children often possess, regardless of species. She approached him quietly, her movements hesitant but determined, and placed her small blue hand atop his closed fist that held the stone. The simple gesture of comfort transcended their differences, speaking directly to the universal language of compassion. In that moment, they were not alien and human, not child and adult, but simply two souls who understood loss and the need for connection in its aftermath. Their journey took them through increasingly varied terrain as they followed a course that Ethel hoped would lead them to more hospitable lands. During one particularly challenging day, they encountered a herd of aggressive herbivores, massive creatures with armored hides and multiple horns that defended their territory with surprising ferocity. The beast blocked the narrow pass that offered the only practical route through the imposing mountain range ahead. Ethel prepared for confrontation, knowing that retreat would cost them precious days and potentially lead them into territories dominated by predators. He readied his spear, calculating the odds of forcing a path through without sustaining serious injuries. But before he could implement his desperate plan, Caitlin stepped forward with unexpected confidence. She began to emit quiet, melodic sounds unlike anything Ethel had heard before. Not quite singing, not quite speech, but something that contained elements of both. As the strange vocalizations continued, her blue skin began to emit a soft, pulsating glow that gradually increased in intensity. The bioluminescence spread across her body in complex patterns, creating a mesmerizing display of living light. The hostile herbivores, which had been pawing the ground and lowering their horned heads in preparation for a charge, grew still. Their aggressive posture relaxed incrementally as the light and sound continued. After several tense minutes, the creatures began to move aside, creating a narrow corridor through their midst. Ethel could scarcely believe what he was witnessing, a natural defense mechanism of Caitlin's species that could calm the local fauna, a biological adaptation that suggested her people had evolved alongside these creatures or similar ones. As they passed safely through the herd, Ethel realized with growing certainty that this child was far more than a helpless orphan who needed his protection. She possessed abilities and knowledge that were invaluable for survival on this world, abilities that might very well save them both in the challenges that lay ahead. Their alliance was tested severely during a crossing of a swampy region that stretched for miles in all directions, blocking their path to the distant mountains where Ethel believed they might find a more temperate climate. The murky waters of the swamp concealed countless dangers, from predatory reptilian creatures with too many teeth to carnivorous plants that could engulf unwary travelers in seconds. Despite their caution, disaster struck when Caitlin lost her footing on a deceptively solid-looking patch of vegetation. She plunged into water teeming with microscopic parasites, organisms that Ethel had observed causing horrific infections in the local wildlife, but had hoped to avoid through careful navigation of the treacherous terrain. He pulled her from the contaminated water immediately, but the damage had been done. By the following morning, she had developed a high fever that caused her blue skin to pale to an alarming shade. Her small body convulsed with chills despite the sweltering heat of the day, and the wound where the parasites had entered through a small cut on her leg showed angry red streaks spreading upward. Ethel recognized the signs of a systemic infection that her body, adapted for life on this world though it was, could not fight without assistance. His medical knowledge was limited to basic first aid and the few local remedies he had discovered through desperate trial and error during his months alone. But none seemed adequate for the aggressive parasite that threatened Caitlin's life. The thought of losing her, this child who had somehow become his responsibility, his companion, perhaps even his salvation in the midst of crushing solitude, filled him with cold terror. He could not fail again, could not watch another life slip away because of his inadequacy. The weight of past losses pressed upon him with suffocating intensity as he cradled her fevered body and tried to recall everything he had observed during his time on this planet that might offer a solution. Then with sudden clarity he remembered, just before the attack by the Bone Ripper, Caitlin's mother had been gathering flowers with distinctive purple leaves. At the time, focused on the approaching predator, he had dismissed the activity as inconsequential. Now he realized it might have been vitally important. Those plants could be medicinal, particularly if the woman had been collecting them rather than simply admiring their strange beauty. Leaving Caitlin in a sheltered alcove formed by the twisted roots of an enormous swamp tree, he embarked on a desperate search for the distinctive purple-leaf plants. The search took him back through the dangerous swamplands and into the territories of creatures he had carefully avoided during their journey. It was a race against time through areas where a single misstep could mean death, his determination to save the child driving him beyond the limits of caution he had maintained for survival. After hours of frantic searching, he found a small cluster of the plants growing on the boundary between the swamp and drier land. With reverent care, he gathered them, noting the subtle differences between similar-looking species that might be harmful rather than helpful. The journey back to Caitlin was even more perilous, as exhaustion dulled his reflexes and the precious plants required protection from the caustic environmental elements that could destroy their medicinal properties. He returned to find her conditions significantly worsened, her breathing shallow and her skin hot to the touch, despite its increasingly pale color. Working with desperate speed tempered by the precision his scientific training had instilled, he prepared a decoction from the plants, using techniques he had observed among the indigenous sentient species he had occasionally glimpsed from a distance during his solitary travels. All through the long night that followed, he sat beside her, administering small amounts of the bitter liquid whenever she showed signs of consciousness. He bathed her burning forehead with cool water, spoke to her in low, soothing tones despite knowing she couldn't understand his words, and fought against the encroaching despair that threatened to overwhelm him as her condition showed little improvement. As the first light of dawn crept through the tangled canopy above them, Caitlin's fever finally broke. The angry red streaks on her leg had receded, and her breathing grew deeper, more regular. When she opened her eyes and focused on his face, recognition replacing the fever-induced confusion of the previous day, Ethel felt a profound relief that manifested as a physical sensation, as if an enormous weight had been lifted from his chest, allowing him to breathe properly for the first time in days. And then she did something that changed everything. She smiled at him. It was a weak, tentative expression, but unmistakable in its meaning. In that moment, despite the absence of shared language, Despite the vast differences in their biology and origins, something profound was communicated, a connection that transcended the circumstances that had brought them together. After regaining sufficient strength, they continued their journey toward the distant mountains that promised more hospitable conditions than the swamplands and arid plains they had traversed. Caitlin's recovery had altered their relationship in subtle but significant ways. The last vestiges of wariness had vanished, replaced by a growing interdependence that manifested in countless small gestures. The way she would automatically gather specific plants without being asked, knowing they were useful for his various ailments. How he would adjust his pace to accommodate her shorter strides without making it obvious that he was doing so. The silent communication that allowed them to coordinate their actions when hunting or avoiding danger. One day, as they followed a winding game trail through increasingly rocky terrain, Ethel noticed something that sent a chill through his body despite the scorching heat. Enormous footprints pressed deep into the soft earth near a water source. The distinctive pattern of the prints was unmistakable. Another bone ripper, and judging by the size of the impressions, even larger than the one he had killed. With growing unease, he realized this might be the mate of the creature he had slain, following their scent trail across the vast distances they had covered. These predators were known for their territorial behavior, but also for the fierce bonds they formed with their chosen mates, bonds that could lead to relentless pursuit, much if one partner was killed. The past they had fled was literally on their heels, threatening to repeat itself with even more devastating consequences. This time, however, Ethel was determined to control the encounter rather than react to it. They would not be caught unprepared, would not be forced into a defensive position where their options were limited. After careful consideration of the surrounding terrain, he identified a narrow gorge that offered the perfect location for an ambush, a place where the creature's size would be a disadvantage rather than an asset, where its movements would be constrained by the close quarters. This time, he would not be attempting a desperate rescue. He would be executing a planned defense with every advantage he could engineer. Together with Caitlin, whose understanding of his intentions had grown remarkably acute despite their limited verbal communication, they prepared an elaborate trap. Using techniques that combined Ethel's knowledge of physics and engineering with Caitlin's insight into the creature's sensory capabilities, they created a deadly welcome for the pursuing predator. When the massive bone ripper finally appeared, following their deliberately laid scent trail into the narrow confines of the gorge, the battle that ensued was brutal but controlled. Ethel had positioned himself on a ledge above the creature's path, armed with multiple spears and a crude but effective sling that could launch stones with bone-breaking force. Caitlin, despite his initial protests, had insisted on participating from a relatively safe vantage point, where she could use her bioluminescent abilities to momentarily blind or distract the beast at critical moments. The bone ripper, enraged by the scent of the human who had killed its mate, charged into the gorge with a roar that shook loose stones from the walls. It was everything Ethel had feared, larger, stronger, and driven by a primal fury that made it even more dangerous than the first one he had faced. But this time, he was prepared. The battle raged with heart-stopping intensity. Each movement, each attack and counterattack calculated with precision, born of desperate necessity. Ethel used every advantage the terrain offered, every weapon they had prepared, and every distraction Caitlin could provide with her abilities. Despite their preparations, the outcome remained uncertain as the creature proved remarkably adaptable, learning from each failed attempt to reach them and adjusting its strategy with an intelligence that would have been admirable in any other context. In the end, it was not Ethel's spear that delivered the killing blow, but a cascade of boulders they had painstakingly positioned at the top of the gorge. As the creature lunged upward toward Ethel's position, Caitlin triggered the release mechanism they had constructed, sending tons of rock crashing down on the predator with devastating force. When the dust settled and they cautiously approached the motionless form buried beneath the rubble, Ethel felt not triumph but a somber recognition that they had closed a chapter in their shared history. The creature that had pursued them, driven by the same bond of attachment that was growing between himself and Caitlin, had met its end. There was a certain symmetry to it, a completion of the cycle that had begun with their first violent meeting. The mountains loomed closer now, their snow-capped peaks promising relief from the relentless heat of the lowland lands. Ethel and Caitlin stood on a high ridge, surveying the vast panorama that stretched before them. Behind lay the deadly swamps, the arid plains, and the narrow gorge where they had finally put the specter of the bone rippers to rest. Ahead sprawled a verdant valley nestled between the arms of the mountain range. A place where water flowed in abundance and diverse plant life suggested a more hospitable environment than anything they had encountered since their paths crossed. Ethel looked down at his small companion, noting the changes that had occurred during their journey. She stood taller now, her posture reflecting a confidence that had been absent in the grief-stricken child he had first encountered. Her blue skin had regained its vibrant hue, and the patterns of bioluminescence that occasionally rippled across it had become more controlled, more purposeful. As they prepared to descend into the valley that might become their new home, at least temporarily, Caitlin extended her small blue hand toward him. It was a deliberate gesture, not one of need or fear as it might have been earlier in their relationship. Ethel hesitated only briefly before gently taking her hand in his much larger one. The contact symbolized everything they had become to each other: protector and protected, teacher and student, survivor and survivor. He had failed to save her mother, a failure that would always haunt him. But he had saved Caitlin, had guided her through dangers that would have claimed her young life many times over without his presence. And in return, she had saved him from the crushing solitude that had threatened to erode his humanity in this alien world. She had given him purpose beyond mere survival, a reason to continue fighting against the overwhelming odds they faced. Together they began the long descent into the valley, moving not as hunter and prey, not as alien and human, but as something new that had no name in either of their languages. Father and daughter perhaps, though not by blood. Companions certainly, bound by shared hardship and mutual dependence. Whatever term might apply, they moved forward as a unit, leaving behind the red earth stained with blue blood that had marked the beginning of their unlikely alliance. Days stretched into weeks, and weeks into months, as they established a life in the valley that proved more hospitable than anywhere else they had encountered on this world. The region offered abundant water, diverse plant life that included many edible species, and a more temperate climate than the scorching plains or humid swamps they had traversed. Though predators existed here as well, they were smaller and less aggressive than the bone rippers, more easily deterred by the defenses Ethel and Caitlin established around their growing settlement. They built a simple shelter near a clear stream, using construction techniques that combined Ethel's engineering knowledge with materials and methods native to this world that Caitlin understood instinctively. The structure evolved over time from a basic lean-to into a more permanent dwelling with separate spaces for sleeping, food storage, and the various tools they crafted to make their existence more comfortable. Their communication developed rapidly once they had the stability to focus on it. Ethel learned words in Caitlin's language, musical sounds with subtle tonal variations that his human vocal apparatus struggled to reproduce correctly. She absorbed English with remarkable speed, her young mind adapting to the new linguistic patterns with an ease Ethel envied. They developed a hybrid dialect for everyday use, supplemented with gestures and drawings when necessary to convey complex concepts. "The water tastes like home," Caitlin remarked one morning as they collected drinking water from the stream. It was one of her increasingly frequent comments that revealed glimpses of the life she had led before their paths crossed. Her voice, once hesitant when attempting human speech, had gained confidence and fluidity. Ethel paused in his task, looking up from the collection vessel he had crafted from local materials. "Your home? Was it far from here?" he asked, seizing the opportunity to learn more about her origins, a subject she rarely broached voluntarily. Caitlin's gaze turned upward, not toward the purplish sky visible through the canopy of vegetation, but beyond it, toward the stars that would emerge when darkness fell. "The stars moved," she explained, using a combination of English words and gestures to convey concepts she lacked vocabulary for. "We followed. Mother said we would find others here." "Others like you?" Ethel asked gently, careful not to push too hard on what might still be a painful topic. "More of your people?" She nodded, her large eyes reflecting the sunlight that dappled through the leaves above them. "A colony," she confirmed, using one of the English words she had recently mastered. "Near big water. Many days' journey." She made an expansive gesture with her hands, indicating something vastly larger than their stream. This was the first concrete information Ethel had received about her people's presence on this planet, an organized colony rather than scattered individuals or small family units. Near large water, an ocean or a lake perhaps, the knowledge ignited a spark of possibility that had been dormant since his own expedition's catastrophic failure. If an alien species had established a colony, they might possess technology, medical knowledge, even some means of communication with other worlds. More importantly for their immediate concerns, finding such a colony would mean Caitlin could be among her own kind again. She could learn the skills and knowledge unique to her species that Ethel, despite his best efforts, could never teach her. She could have a future beyond mere survival in the wilderness with a human companion who would inevitably age and die long before she reached full maturity. "We'll find them," he promised. The decision forming with surprising clarity. Their life in the valley had become comfortable, almost routine, but it had always been a temporary respite rather than a permanent solution. Now they had a destination, a purpose beyond day-to-day survival. Their preparations for the journey to find the colony occupied them through the local equivalent of winter, a season marked not by snow but by torrential rains that transformed parts of the valley into impassable quagmires. They used the forced period of relative inactivity to accumulate supplies, improve their weapons, and craft durable traveling gear from materials that would withstand the varied environments they might encounter. Ethel constructed a detailed map based on astronomical observations and landscape features, attempting to determine the most likely location for a colony near big water based on the limited information Caitlin could provide. The child's memory of her journey with her mother before the fatal encounter with the Bone Ripper was fragmented and difficult to translate into navigational terms, but certain details, a distinctive mountain peak, a river that flowed red due to mineral content, a forest of crystalline structures that rang like bells when the wind blew, provided potential landmarks to guide their search. As the rainy season gave way to more favorable conditions, they set out from the valley that had sheltered them through so many cycles of this world's twin moons. Their journey toward the hypothetical location of the colony took them through landscapes of breathtaking beauty and terrifying danger. Forests where the trees grew sideways, reaching for each other rather than the sky, creating natural arches and bridges that spanned impossible distances. Plains covered in crystalline formations that rang like bells beneath their feet, creating complex harmonies that changed with each step. Canyons so deep that darkness pooled at their bottoms like liquid, concealing creatures that hunted by sound rather than sight. Throughout their travels, Caitlin's command of human language expanded exponentially. She began asking questions about Earth, about humans, about the expedition that had brought Ethel to this world, and the disaster that had separated him from his companions. Their conversations during rest periods and around evening campfires became increasingly sophisticated, touching on subjects that ranged from the practical to the philosophical. "Were you alone before?" she asked one night as they sat beside their small fire, sheltered in the hollow trunk of an enormous fallen tree-like organism. Above them, unfamiliar constellations glittered in patterns that Ethel had mapped meticulously during his months of solitude, using them for navigation in the absence of familiar stars. "No," Ethel replied, the single word heavy with memories he usually kept carefully contained. "I had friends, colleagues, a team of scientists and explorers. Family once, though they remained on Earth when I joined the expedition." "What happened to the others who came with you?" Caitlin pressed, her large eyes reflecting the flickering firelight as she watched his expression with the uncanny perception she often displayed. Ethel stared into the flames, seeing not the fire before him, but the catastrophic events that had stranded him on this world. "Our ship malfunctioned during orbital insertion," he explained, using simplified terms for concepts she might not fully understand. "The emergency protocols activated, separating the vessel into survival pods. My pod, along with 5 others, reached the surface. The rest," he gestured upward, indicating the fate of those whose pods had failed to deploy properly or had burned up during entry. "The survivors established a base camp. We had supplies, equipment, even limited communication capabilities, though we never received a response to our distress signals. For almost a year, we explored, documented, survived." His voice grew more distant as he continued, recounting events he had replayed countless times in his mind during sleepless nights. Then came the floods, a canyon much like the one we crossed 3 days ago. I was scouting ahead with Yoshida, looking for a safe passage. When we returned to where we had left the others, his voice faltered. They were gone, Caitlin finished for him, perceiving the direction of his narrative from his expression and tone. Swept away by a flash flood that appeared without warning, Ethel confirmed. Yoshida and I searched for survivors for weeks. Eventually, he too was lost, to a predator we hadn't encountered before. After that, I was truly alone until— he looked at her directly, until I heard your mother's cries for help. Caitlin was silent for a long moment, absorbing this history and its implications. That is why you fought the Bone Ripper, she said finally, the statement carrying a depth of understanding beyond her years. Why you tried to save my mother even though she was not your kind. Ethel nodded, his throat tight with emotion he rarely allowed himself to express. I couldn't save them, my team, Yoshida. I wanted to save her. Needed to. Caitlin moved closer, her small body radiating a comfortable warmth in the chill night air as she leaned against his side. The gesture of comfort required no words, transcending their biological differences. You saved me, she said simply, the statement encompassing all that had transpired between them. The dangers overcome, the trust established, the bond formed across the vast gulf of their different origins. The local seasons changed as their journey continued. They experienced the equivalent of winter in higher elevations, a season marked by strange geometric snowflakes that burned slightly on contact with skin and had to be carefully brushed away before they could melt and cause more serious damage. They sheltered in caves during the worst of these crystalline storms, hunting only when absolutely necessary and surviving primarily on preserved foods. And Caitlin's knowledge of which dormant plants remain safe and nutritious beneath the glittering frost. During this period of reduced mobility, Ethel noticed accelerated changes in Caitlin that suggested her species matured at a different rate than humans. Though still a child by her people's standards, she was growing rapidly, her limbs lengthening, her features becoming more defined, her movements gaining precision and grace. Most notably, the bioluminescence in her skin, once an involuntary response to strong emotions, had become increasingly controlled and purposeful. She could now produce different colors and patterns for various purposes. The calming blue that had allowed them to pass safely through herds of aggressive herbivores, a healing green that accelerated the closure of minor wounds when applied directly to injured tissue, a warning purple that signaled danger more effectively than any verbal alert could. These abilities emerged seemingly without conscious effort on her part, as if encoded in her genetic makeup, awakening as she matured even without the guidance of adult members of her species. As favorable conditions returned and they resumed their journey toward the coast, they encountered increasing evidence of sentient activity, crude markers along game trails, remains of temporary camps, even occasional glimpses of bipedal figures moving through distant forests or across open plains. These were not Caitlin's people, who remained distinctive with their blue skin and graceful movements, but other intelligent species that appeared to travel regularly through these territories. One evening, as they prepared to make camp in a defensible position near a natural spring, they were approached by a group of traders, tall, thin beings with iridescent skin that shifted colors continuously, creating mesmerizing patterns that seemed to serve as a form of non-verbal communication among them. They carried packs made from materials Ethel had not encountered before and wielded tools that suggested a level of technological development beyond simple stone and wood. Initially wary, both parties maintained a cautious distance, weapons ready but not brandished aggressively. It was Caitlin who broke the impasse, stepping forward with a series of melodic sounds that appeared to be a formal greeting in a trade language used by multiple species in this region. To Ethel's surprise, the leader of the trader group responded in kind, then switched to a simplified form of Caitlin's native language that she could understand. What followed was the most extensive exchange of information Ethel had experienced since losing contact with his expedition. Through Caitlin's translation, supplemented by gestures and drawings when linguistic gaps occurred, he learned more about this world and its complex ecosystem of intelligent beings than months of solo exploration had revealed. Most importantly, the traders confirmed the existence of the colony Caitlin sought, a thriving community of her species established on the shores of a vast inland sea. They had conducted trade with the colony for generations, exchanging goods and information along established routes that connected various settlements across the continent. 3 moons' journey, said the leader of the traders, a being who introduced himself with a musical name that translated approximately as Farwalker. He pointed toward distant mountains visible as a purple smudge on the horizon. Through the singing pass, then follow the long river to where it meets the dreaming sea. Your kind have built a city there, he added, addressing Caitlin directly, a place of light and water. His attention then shifted to Ethel, head tilting in a manner that suggested curiosity or puzzlement. But be warned, the colony does not welcome all visitors. They have had difficulties with some of your kind before. My kind? Ethel asked, surprised by this information. Humans, Farwalker clarified, using a word that approximated the English term. A group came with weapons that speak thunder. They took some of the blue ones for study. There was fighting, blood spilled on both sides. The revelation sent a chill through Ethel that had nothing to do with the evening's cooling temperature. Military personnel, scientists with military escorts. He had no way of knowing which human faction had reached the colony first, but their actions had clearly poisoned relations between the species. It would make his arrival with Caitlin complicated, perhaps even dangerous, depending on how recently these events had occurred and how deeply the wounds ran. Despite this concerning information, they had no alternative but to continue toward the colony. Caitlin needed her people, needed to be among her own kind to learn the skills and knowledge unique to her species that were beginning to manifest as she matured. And Ethel had made a promise, one he intended to keep, regardless of the potential consequences for himself. The traders shared their camp that night, exchanging stories and information that helped fill gaps in Ethel's understanding of this world. They traded some of the specialized tools Ethel had crafted for preserved foods that would supplement their provisions during the mountain crossing, and for a crude but accurate map of the route ahead marked with watering places and potential dangers. As they parted ways the following morning, Farwalker offered a final piece of advice. When you reach the colony, approach from the eastern shore near the Weeping Cliffs. A guardian post is established there, one where younglings are sometimes stationed. They may be more receptive to your unusual pairing than the warrior caste that patrols other boundaries. The singing pass earned its name in a way Ethel could never have anticipated. Wind threading through the narrow mountain corridor created eerie, haunting melodies that changed with each gust, sometimes sounding like distant voices calling across vast distances, other times like instruments playing complex harmonies that no human orchestra could replicate. The acoustic phenomenon had a profound effect on Caitlin, who spent hours listening with an expression of reverent attention. The mountains remember everyone who passes through them, she explained when Ethel questioned her fascination. They sing the stories of all travelers to those who know how to listen properly. What story do you think they'll sing about us? Ethel asked, only half joking as they made their way through the winding passage beneath towering peaks. Caitlin tilted her head, listening to the ethereal music with an intensity that suggested she might actually understand some meaning in the seemingly random sounds. A story about those who were lost and then found, she said after a thoughtful pause, about a blue child and a pink giant who became family under strange stars. The description, simple though it was, captured their journey with surprising accuracy. They had both been lost in different ways, he through the catastrophic failure of his mission, she through the violent death of her mother. Their unlikely alliance had indeed transformed into something that resembled family, forged in the harsh conditions of a world that seemed determined to eliminate them at every turn. And always above them hung the unfamiliar constellations that reminded Ethel daily of how far he was from the world of his birth. The mountains eventually gave way to rolling hills covered in vegetation that gradually transitioned from the hardy, drought-resistant species of the highlands to more lush growth as they descended into a broad plain bisected by a winding river, the long river mentioned in the traders' directions. They followed it downstream, traveling with relative ease on the flat terrain beside its banks. Transparent fish with visible internal organs swam in the clear waters, and birds with twin sets of wings soared overhead, creating complex aerial displays that seemed as much artistic as functional. It was here, in this deceptively peaceful landscape, that disaster struck again. A group of human soldiers, wearing the tattered but recognizable uniforms of the military contingent that had accompanied Ethel's scientific expedition, ambushed them as they made camp one evening. They emerged from concealed positions among the riverside vegetation, weapons trained on Ethel and Caitlin with the practiced efficiency of trained combatants. Ethel recognized their leader immediately, though her appearance had changed significantly since he had last seen her more than 2 years earlier. Commander Hayes had been the senior military officer attached to their expedition, responsible for the security of the scientific team. Now she stood before him with a hardened expression, a jagged scar running from her temple to her jaw, and eyes that reflected none of the professional respect that had once characterized their interactions. "Well, look what we have here," Hayes said, her voice raspier than Ethel remembered, but still carrying the unmistakable tone of command. "One of our missing scientists, gone native, and he's even got himself a pet blue." "Commander Hayes," Ethel acknowledged, positioning himself instinctively between the soldiers and Caitlin. "I thought everyone was lost in the canyon flood." "Not everyone," Hayes replied with cold precision. "Some of us were made of tougher stuff. We regrouped, established a secure perimeter, and have been building a defensible settlement while waiting for the arrival of the main force." Her gaze flicked to Caitlin, who stood motionless behind Ethel, her blue skin noticeably dimmer than usual, as if she were consciously suppressing her natural bioluminescence. "And conducting necessary research on the local species, of course, particularly the blues. They've got technology we haven't even begun to understand hidden in that colony of theirs." "She's not a research subject," Ethel said firmly, his hand moving slowly toward the knife at his belt, a pathetic defense against the improvised but still lethal weapons the soldiers carried, but better than nothing. "She's a child, a survivor just like us." Hayes laughed, a harsh sound utterly devoid of humor. "A child of an enemy species. Don't tell me you've forgotten our mission parameters, Dr. Crawford. We came to assess this world's resources and potential threats. Those blueskins have abilities and technology that could pose a significant danger to human interests if we ever establish a permanent presence here." Ethel felt Caitlin trembling slightly where she pressed against his back, though whether from fear or anger, he couldn't determine without seeing her face. "Our mission was scientific exploration and first contact, not exploitation," he corrected, falling back on the ethical protocols that had been drummed into every member of the expedition before departure, and certainly not kidnapping children or provoking interspecies conflict. "Circumstances changed when we crashed," Hayes said flatly, her expression hardening further. "Survival became the priority, then tactical advantage. You'll come with us now, both of you. The blue one will be useful leverage in our ongoing negotiations with the colony." What followed was chaos. Ethel struck first, knowing they were outnumbered and outarmed, but hoping to create enough confusion for Caitlin to escape toward the river, where her natural swimming abilities might give her an advantage. The soldiers, though equipped with makeshift weapons rather than standard firearms, their ammunition long since exhausted, were trained fighters with years of combat experience. Ethel took a devastating blow to the head that sent him reeling, blood streaming into his eyelids from a deep gash across his forehead. Through blurred vision, he saw two soldiers grab Caitlin by her arms, but they had underestimated her. Her skin flared with a brilliant pulsing light, not the calm blue or healing green he had come to know, but a searing white that momentarily blinded everyone looking directly at her. Using the distraction, Ethel knocked down the nearest soldier and grabbed Caitlin's hand. Together they ran toward the river, plunging into the swift current that immediately swept them downstream, away from Hayes and her people who shouted and fired ineffectual projectiles after them. They allowed the river to carry them for miles, fighting to keep their heads above water while avoiding the numerous obstacles that could have dashed them against rocks or trapped them in submerged vegetation. When they finally managed to reach the opposite shore, they were cold, battered, and exhausted, but alive and at least temporarily beyond the immediate reach of their pursuers. Caitlin's extraordinary light display had dimmed, leaving her looking drained and unusually pale. She sat shivering on the riverbank as Ethel built a small, carefully concealed fire to warm them and dry their sodden clothing and gear. "I didn't know you could do that," he said once the immediate necessities had been addressed. "Neither did I," she admitted, her voice small and uncertain. "It just happened. I was afraid, not for myself, but for you. I saw them hurt you, and then something burst inside me." Ethel looked at his young companion with renewed wonder and a growing concern. Even after more than a year together, this child, no, this young person of an alien species, could still surprise him with abilities that emerged spontaneously under stress. How much of her people's natural capabilities remained dormant within her, awaiting only necessity or maturity to manifest? And how would Hayes and her soldiers interpret such abilities if they managed to recapture them? The encounter changed their approach to the final leg of their journey. They traveled primarily at night when possible, using Caitlin's superior night vision and bioluminescent capabilities to navigate safely while remaining less visible to potential human observers. They avoided open areas where they might be spotted from a distance, kept their fires small and well shielded when they needed heat or light, and maintained constant vigilance for signs that they were being followed. Ethel knew Commander Hayes would not abandon the pursuit easily. The woman had always been tenacious, even before the crash stranded them all on this alien world. Her military training would have instilled in her a determination that bordered on obsession when it came to completing objectives. And she clearly viewed capturing Caitlin as a strategic advantage in whatever ongoing conflict existed between her group and the blue-skin colony. The final approach to the Dreaming Sea took them through increasingly fertile land where the vegetation grew in extravagant profusion, creating natural canopies that provided welcome cover from aerial observation. The humidity rose steadily, and the quality of light changed subtly as they neared their destination, a soft, diffuse illumination that seemed to come from all directions rather than directly from the strange sun that dominated the purplish sky. When they finally crested a series of low hills and caught their first glimpse of the Dreaming Sea, Ethel understood immediately why it had earned such a poetic name. The vast body of water shimmered with an inner light that seemed to pulse in slow, hypnotic rhythms, as if the bioluminescence in Caitlin's skin had been magnified 1,000-fold and poured into an ocean basin. In the shallows, the glow was a gentle cyan that reminded Ethel of Earth's tropical waters. In the depths visible from their elevated vantage point, it deepened to a profound indigo that seemed to contain mysteries beyond human comprehension. "Home," Caitlin whispered beside him, her voice barely audible but filled with a longing that transcended language. Her eyes reflected the sea's ethereal light, giving her an otherworldly appearance that reminded Ethel forcefully of her alien nature, a fact he had almost forgotten after their months of shared struggle and growing companionship. The colony sprawled along the shoreline in a breathtaking display of architectural harmony with the natural environment. Unlike the primitive settlement Ethel had half expected, based on the limited technology he had observed Caitlin and her mother using, this was a sophisticated arrangement of structures that seemed to grow organically from the living rock of the coast. Buildings spiraled upward in graceful curves that defied human architectural conventions, creating a city that looked as natural as the waves lapping at its foundations, a living extension of the landscape rather than an imposition upon it. But between them and this marvel of alien civilization lay a final, formidable obstacle. Hayes and her soldiers had somehow arrived ahead of them, having apparently tracked their movements despite all precautions. They had established a camp at the base of the cliffs, directly on the path leading down to the eastern approach to the colony. The very route Farwalker had recommended as potentially more welcoming to their unusual pairing. "They must have found another route," Ethel said grimly, as they observed from a hidden vantage point among the dense vegetation that crowned the cliffs. "Or they never stopped following us, just paralleled our course at a distance." Caitlin stared down at the human camp, her expression unreadable, even to Ethel, who had become adept at interpreting her alien features. "What will they do if they capture us?" she asked, the directness of the question belying her youth. "Try to use us to get what they want," Ethel answered honestly, seeing no point in shielding her from the harsh realities they faced. "You as leverage against your people. Me as a bargaining chip or a punitive example of what happens to those who oppose military authority in crisis situations. They want technology, weapons, knowledge, anything they think might give them an advantage here or back on Earth if they ever manage to make contact again. And if my people refuse their demands?" Ethel hesitated, the truth too harsh to voice aloud. But Caitlin deserved honesty after all they had endured together. "Then Hayes might try to take by force what she can't get through negotiation. She was never one to accept failure, and 2 years stranded here has clearly hardened that tendency into something dangerous." Caitlin nodded slowly, absorbing this assessment with the gravity that often made her seem older than her physical development suggested. Then we must warn them, my people, before it escalates further. How? We can't get past that camp without being spotted. And even if we could, we have no guarantee your people would welcome me any more warmly than Hayes would. Caitlin looked at him, then out at the glowing sea that represented her heritage and future. I can, through the water. Ethel felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. Caitlin, no. We don't know what's in that water besides the bioluminescent organisms. And it's too far to swim, even for your species. Not swim, she corrected, placing her small hands against her chest in a gesture he had seen her make during moments of intense concentration or emotional significance. Call, with this, the light inside me. They will see it, even from the city. And if they don't, they will, she said with a quiet certainty. Mother taught me the emergency call before the bone ripper. I never had cause to use it until now. The plan was dangerous, exposing them to potential detection from the human camp below. But they had no better options, and time was running short. Dawn would soon reveal their position to any observant sentry, and with it would come the loss of their momentary advantage of surprise and choice of timing. They found an outcropping that extended over the sea, partially shielded from the human camp by a natural configuration of rocks that blocked direct line of sight while still providing access to the open water below. There, Caitlin stood at the edge, her small form silhouetted against the luminous water, seeming almost to merge with the ethereal glow that rose from the depths. She began to hum, a strange, resonant tone unlike anything Ethel had heard from her before, even during their moments of greatest danger, or her displays of bioluminescent communication. As she continued, her skin began to glow with increasing intensity, pulsing in complex patterns, concentric rings that expanded outward from her chest, spirals that rotated in alternating directions, starburst patterns that formed and dissolved in rapid succession. Minutes passed, stretching into what felt like hours as Caitlin maintained the extraordinary display. Ethel divided his attention between the mesmerizing sight before him and the human camp below, where figures moved about, oblivious to the communication happening above them. Anxiety gnawed at him as time stretched on with no discernible response from the distant colony. Anything? He whispered after what seemed an eternity, concerned for Caitlin's evident exertion. The sustained bioluminescent display was clearly taxing her resources, her small body trembling visibly with the effort. She did not answer, her concentration absolute as the patterns on her skin accelerated, growing more complex, more urgent in their pulsing rhythms. Sweat, or whatever her species produced as its equivalent, beaded on her forehead, reflecting the light her body generated in tiny prisms of color. Then, just as Ethel was about to insist she stop before exhausting herself completely, he noticed movement in the water far below. Not the random ripples created by wind or aquatic life, but deliberate progression toward the shore, shapes moving swiftly through the glowing depths, leaving trails of disturbed bioluminescence in their wake. Caitlin, he said urgently, touching her shoulder lightly to break her trance-like state. Something's coming. From the water. She finally halted her display, turning to him with an expression of mingled exhaustion and relief. I know, she whispered, collapsing against him as her knees gave way. They heard me. The Guardians come. The Guardians, as it transpired, were specialized members of Caitlin's species who patrolled the waters surrounding the colony, the first line of defense against threats that might approach from the dreaming sea. They emerged from the water with fluid grace, their blue skin patterned with bioluminescent markings far more elaborate and controlled than anything Caitlin had displayed. Even at the height of her emergency call, they moved with silent efficiency, surrounding the human camp before Hayes or her soldiers realized what was happening. There was a brief, one-sided confrontation, the Guardians using some form of sound-based weapon that incapacitated the humans without killing them, rendering them unconscious with a carefully modulated sonic attack that Ethel felt as a painful pressure in his ears, even from their elevated position. By the time Ethel and Caitlin made their way down to the shore, guided by a pair of Guardians who had ascended the cliff to investigate the source of the emergency signal, Hayes and her people had been secured. They lay unconscious but unharmed, bound with restraints that appeared to be composed of some living material that adjusted continuously to prevent injury while ensuring they couldn't escape. A delegation from the colony approached along the shoreline, led by a tall, dignified individual whose elaborate patterned bioluminescence marked him as someone of significant importance in their social hierarchy. His skin was a deeper blue than Caitlin's, almost indigo in the shadows, and his movements carried the fluid grace of someone completely at ease in his environment. Caitlin stepped forward, addressing the elder in the musical language of her people, a complex series of vocalizations supplemented by subtle shifts in her bioluminescent patterns. Ethel could not understand the words, but the emotion behind them was clear. Relief, joy, a sense of homecoming tinged with the lingering sorrow of her mother's loss and the uncertainty of her new situation. The elder listened with grave attention, occasionally asking questions that prompted more detailed explanations from Caitlin. His gaze frequently shifted to Ethel, studying him with eyes that seemed to see beyond the surface, evaluating him on criteria that no human standard could measure. Finally, he approached Ethel directly, surprising him by speaking in perfect, if somewhat formally accented, English. "You are not like these others," he stated, gesturing toward the unconscious soldiers. "The child says you tried to save her mother, that you have been her protector and teacher since that day." Ethel swallowed hard, acutely aware of how he must appear to these sophisticated beings, ragged, scarred, primitive in his tools and techniques compared to the evident advancement of their civilization. "I tried," he acknowledged. "I failed her mother. I didn't want to fail her too." The elder nodded slowly, the bioluminescent patterns on his skin shifting in what Ethel guessed might be their equivalent of thoughtful consideration. "Caitlin tells us you seek redemption for a past you cannot change," he said after a moment. "She says you have earned it through your actions toward her." Ethel glanced at Caitlin, surprised she had understood so much about his inner motivations, feelings he had never explicitly voiced during their time together. She met his gaze steadily, her expression containing a wisdom far beyond her years, as if caring for her had somehow transferred some essential understanding between them that transcended ordinary communication. "What will happen to Hayes and the others?" Ethel asked, his scientist's curiosity reasserting itself now that the immediate danger had passed. "They will be taken to the colony, treated for their injuries, then confined until we can determine whether peaceful coexistence is possible," the elder replied with remarkable equanimity, given the apparent history of conflict between the humans and his people. "We are not executioners, Dr. Crawford, not even of those who would do us harm. That is not our way." Ethel nodded, relieved despite everything that had transpired. He had no love for Hayes and her militaristic approach, but they were still his species, still fellow survivors of a catastrophe that had stranded them all on this alien world. "And Caitlin?" he asked, voicing the question that had weighed on him since they first set out to find the colony, the inevitable separation that would follow their arrival. The elder placed a gentle hand on the child's head in a gesture that seemed both blessing and acknowledgement. "She will take her place among our people, learn our ways, grow in the knowledge her mother would have taught her had fate been kinder." He paused, studying Ethel with that penetrating gaze that seemed to evaluate him on levels beyond physical appearance. "The question that remains is, what of you, human scientist?" It was the moment Ethel had been both anticipating and dreading since they had first set out to find the colony. He had always known that Caitlin needed to be with her own kind, needed the specialized knowledge and cultural understanding that only they could provide as she matured. But the thought of leaving her, of returning to his solitary existence in this harsh world after all they had shared, felt like losing his family all over again. Before he could frame a response, Caitlin spoke, first in her native language to the elder, then in English to Ethel. "I told him you are Cathal V," she said, using a word from her language that he had never heard before. "It means one who becomes family by choice rather than birth. It is a sacred designation among my people, rare but honored when it occurs." She took his hand in both of hers, her blue fingers contrasting sharply with his sun-darkened skin. "You can stay, if you want to." Ethel looked from Caitlin to the elder, uncertain if he had understood correctly. The elder inclined his head in confirmation. "The child speaks truth. Our traditions recognize bonds formed through shared hardship and mutual protection. You have earned a place among us, should you choose to accept it." His expression grew more serious. "But it will not be easy. You would be the only human among us, at least until relations with your kind can be normalized. There will be those who fear or distrust you, especially after our experiences with others of your species. There were those who feared and distrusted me on my own world, Ethel replied with a faint smile, thinking of academic rivals who had ridiculed his theories, military attachés who had viewed his ethical concerns as weakness, even family members who had never understood his drive to explore beyond Earth's boundaries. I'm used to being the outsider. The elders' bioluminescent patterns shifted in what Ethel now recognized as their equivalent of amusement. Then come, both of you. The colony awaits, and there is much to learn and much to teach. As they walked along the shore toward the beautiful, spiral structures of the colony, Caitlin's small blue hand firmly in his, Ethel felt a profound sense of coming home, not to a place but to a purpose. He had crossed the stars, survived the crash that killed most of his expedition, endured the loss of everyone he had known on this world, fought monsters both animal and human, and in the process he had found something he thought had been lost forever. Family. The little alien girl had once shouted at him in anger and grief, believing he had hurt her mother. Now she led him toward a new life, a new beginning among her people, not as a scientist studying an alien world, not as a survivor fighting merely to stay alive, but as Cathalvi, one who becomes family through choice and shared experience rather than accident of birth. Ethel squeezed Caitlin's hand gently as they approached the gates of the colony, where blue-skinned figures waited to welcome their lost child home. "Thank you," he said softly, the words inadequate for the emotion behind them. Caitlin looked up at him, her large eyes reflecting the light of this world's strange sun in the bioluminescent glow of her own people. "For what?" "For showing me your hands," he replied, recalling their first meeting when he had knelt in the red dust, showing her his empty palms in a desperate attempt to communicate his innocence. "When all I could show you were mine." She smiled then, the same smile that had first appeared when her fever broke, when she had realized she would live. But now it contained so much more. Wisdom, affection, the promise of a future neither of them could have imagined when they first met on the blood-stained red earth. Together they stepped into that future, leaving behind the solitary struggles that had defined their past. The human and the alien child, united by circumstance but bound by choice, entered the luminous city by the dreaming sea, each incomplete without the other, each made whole by what they had become together. If you like this story, please click the hype button. This video deserves to be popular.